What if something you did at 16 was quietly changing the way your brain learned? What if the most important effect wasn't something you could feel? No dramatic warning, no sudden transformation, no obvious moment when everything changed. Instead, what if the difference was hidden in something much harder to notice? The speed at which you remember, the ability to concentrate, the time it takes to solve a problem, the ability to learn something new. Because during the teenage years, the brain isn't simply sitting there waiting for adulthood. It is under construction. Connections are being strengthened. Others are being removed. Different regions are learning how to communicate more efficiently. And this raises a fascinating and uncomfortable question. What happens when cannabis enters the picture while that construction is still underway? A major new study involving more than 11,000 young people may have brought us closer to an answer. And what researchers discovered wasn't simply that cannabis-using teenagers performed worse on a test. The story was more subtle and potentially more important. Their brains appear to be making slower gains over time. So could cannabis be interfering not just with what a teenager knows, but with how quickly their developing brain is learning to become more capable? And if that's true, how would you even notice it? Imagine taking a snapshot of a construction site. You see steel beams, wires, concrete, machines, workers moving everywhere. Now imagine coming back 5 years later. The building is completely different. The teenage brain is somewhat like that. It is constantly changing. The brain continues developing into the 20s, with important systems involved in attention, memory, learning, decision-making, and impulse control still maturing during adolescence. And that matters because cannabis doesn't simply interact with an empty space. Its main intoxicating compound, THC, interacts with the brain's cannabinoid system. So here's the first big question. Could introducing THC during this critical period alter the trajectory of development? For years, scientists have tried to answer that question, and the answer hasn't been simple. Some studies have found associations between adolescent cannabis use and problems involving memory, attention, and learning. But there's always been an important scientific problem. Correlation isn't causation. If a teenager who uses cannabis has poorer academic performance, is cannabis responsible? Or could there be other factors? Family environment, stress, mental health, other substances, sleep, socioeconomic conditions, or perhaps characteristics that existed before cannabis use even began? This is why the latest research is so interesting. Because instead of simply comparing cannabis users with non-users at one point in time, researchers followed young people as they grew. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, who performs better? Researchers can begin asking, who is improving faster? And that may be a much more revealing question. The study came from researchers at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. They analyzed data from more than 11,000 participants in the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, one of the largest long-term studies of brain development in American youth. These children were followed from roughly ages 9 or 10 into their teenage years. Think about what that means. Researchers weren't looking at a single moment. They were watching development unfold, year after year, test after test, childhood, then adolescence, then the teenage years. And during that time, some participants began using cannabis. That gave researchers an opportunity to ask a very different question. Not, are cannabis users less intelligent? That's not what the study showed. Instead, what happens to the rate of cognitive growth after cannabis use begins? And this is where the findings became especially interesting. Imagine two teenagers. At age 10, both are developing normally. They take a memory test, then an attention test, then tests involving language and processing speed. Their scores aren't necessarily identical, but both are developing. Now fast forward several years. One continues improving. The other doesn't seem to be progressing at the same rate. That difference may be subtle. You might not notice it walking down the hallway at school. You wouldn't necessarily see it in a photograph. But over time, small differences in the rate of development can accumulate. Researchers found that teens who used cannabis showed restricted growth over time across several cognitive areas, including memory, attention, language, and processing speed. And that creates a remarkable possibility. Maybe the important story isn't cannabis makes teenagers suddenly lose their intelligence. Maybe the story is, while the brain is supposed to be getting better at certain things, cannabis use may be associated with a slower rate of improvement. That's a very different idea, and arguably a much more unsettling one, because you don't have to lose something for your development to be affected. You simply have to gain it more slowly. Now think about memory. It sounds simple. You remember your friend's name. You remember where you left your phone. You remember what you studied yesterday. But memory isn't one single ability. It is a complicated system that allows us to take information, hold on to it, manipulate it, and eventually retrieve it when we need it. And learning depends on it. Imagine trying to learn algebra if yesterday's lesson keeps disappearing. Imagine learning a new language when vocabulary doesn't stick. Imagine listening to a teacher explain something complicated and finding that pieces of the explanation simply don't stay with you. This is why memory is so important during adolescence. Teenagers are spending years building knowledge, learning abstract concepts, developing skills, preparing for work, preparing for university or college, learning how to navigate relationships, learning how to make decisions. And much of that depends on the brain becoming increasingly efficient. So here's another question. What happens when a developing brain encounters something that can interfere with memory and attention? The CDC notes that cannabis can directly affect brain functions involving memory, learning, attention, decision-making, and reaction time, and that adolescents may be especially vulnerable because their brains are still developing. But there's another layer to the story. The new research didn't stop at memory. Researchers looked across multiple cognitive abilities, attention, language, processing speed, and other aspects of thinking. The pattern suggested something broader than one isolated memory problem. It suggested that cannabis use during adolescence was associated with slower development across multiple areas. And that leads to a much bigger question. Could the teenage brain be particularly sensitive to cannabis because this is exactly when the brain is becoming more efficient? Think about a teenager learning to drive. At first, everything requires conscious attention. Check the mirror, watch the road, control the pedals, read the signs. Eventually, many of those processes become automatic. The brain becomes more efficient. Development is partly about turning effortful processes into faster, more coordinated ones. Now imagine interfering with that process. Would the teenager suddenly become incapable? No, that's not what the evidence says. But could development proceed differently? To understand why researchers are interested in cannabis specifically, we have to talk about THC. THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the main intoxicating component of cannabis. It affects the brain's cannabinoid system, and the effects can include changes in attention, memory, coordination, reaction time, and perception. For an adult brain, those effects are already important, but adolescence introduces another variable: development. The brain is changing, networks are being refined, connections are being reorganized, and the question becomes, could THC exposure during this period influence those developmental processes? The latest study provided another important clue. Researchers looked at biological evidence of THC exposure in a smaller group of participants. Those with evidence of THC exposure showed worse memory over time compared with those without that exposure. That doesn't answer every question, but it gives scientists something extremely valuable, a clue about which component of cannabis may be involved. And now the mystery becomes even more interesting. That's the question scientists are now investigating. Before we go any further, there's something we need to make absolutely clear. This study does not mean that every teenager who uses cannabis will experience permanent cognitive problems. And it does not prove that cannabis alone caused every difference researchers observed. Science rarely works that simply. There can be dozens of variables involved in human development. The CDC itself notes that long-term brain effects may also involve factors such as genetics, home environment, and other unknown influences. This distinction matters because there's a huge difference between saying cannabis is associated with slower cognitive development and saying cannabis causes every cognitive problem in every teenager. The first statement reflects what the research supports. The second goes far beyond it. And good science lives in that distinction. But even with that caution, the findings raise an important concern. Because adolescence isn't just another stage of life. It's a period when the brain is rapidly developing, and delaying development during a critical window could potentially matter. Now consider two people. One starts using cannabis at 25. Another starts at 14. Are their brains in the same developmental state? No. That's one reason age of first use matters so much. The brain continues developing through adolescence and into young adulthood. The CDC reports that starting cannabis during adolescence may affect how the brain builds connections involved in attention, memory, and learning. And the risk isn't necessarily determined by one factor. Researchers point to several variables. How old was someone when they started? How frequently do they use cannabis? How much THC are they exposed to? How potent is the product? Are other substances involved? And what was happening in that person's life before cannabis entered the picture? These questions matter because cannabis isn't one uniform exposure. A single experience and frequent high THC use are not necessarily equivalent. So when we hear teen cannabis use affects the brain, the next question should be how much, how often, at what age, and in whom? Here's where the story gets particularly interesting. Suppose cannabis doesn't make someone obviously impaired all the time. Suppose they can still joke with friends, play video games, go to school. Those are the questions researchers still need to answer. Hold a conversation, pass some classes. From the outside, everything looks normal. So how would you know whether development had slowed? You might not. And that's precisely what makes cognitive development so difficult to observe. It's not a light switch. It's a curve, a trajectory, a gradual change over years. And perhaps that's why the phrase slower growth is so important. Imagine two runners. At the starting line, they're almost equal, but one runner gradually loses a few inches every 100 meters. At first, you barely notice. Then the race continues and continues. Eventually, the distance becomes obvious. The concern raised by this research is somewhat similar. Not necessarily that cannabis instantly destroys cognitive abilities, but that during years when the brain should be gaining capability, the rate of improvement may be reduced. And if that happens during a critical developmental window, how much could those small differences matter years later? We don't fully know yet, and that's the part of the story that researchers are still trying to uncover. Now take this into a classroom. A teenager has to listen, remember, process, analyze, solve, write, switch between tasks, control impulses, and retain enough information to use it later. Those are cognitive skills. And cannabis can affect several of the brain functions that support them. The CDC also reports that young people who use cannabis may have problems with memory and learning and may not do as well in school. But here's the interesting part. A teenager doesn't necessarily think, my cognitive development may be progressing more slowly. Instead, they might think, I'm just tired. I'm bored. That class is stupid. I can't concentrate today. Whatever I studied last night just didn't stick. There could be countless explanations, and that's why the research matters. It helps scientists look beyond the individual moment and examine the pattern across years. Here's a difficult question. What if a teenager says, I use cannabis and I'm fine? Could that be true? Absolutely. Individual experiences vary. Some people may not notice obvious problems. Others may experience significant effects. And some effects may be temporary, while others may persist longer. The existence of a population-level association doesn't tell us exactly what will happen to one individual. But public health isn't based on asking, does everyone experience the same outcome? It's based on asking, does this behavior increase risk? And the evidence increasingly suggests that adolescent cannabis use carries meaningful risks for the developing brain. The CDC specifically identifies problems with thinking, problem-solving, memory, learning, and attention among potential negative effects. So the question isn't whether every teenager will be affected. The question is, why take the risk during a period when the brain is still being built? And there's another part of the story we shouldn't ignore. Cannabis isn't only about cognition. Teen cannabis use has also been associated with other risks, including cannabis use disorder and mental health concerns. And the earlier someone starts using cannabis, particularly with frequent use, the greater the concern about developing problematic use. That creates a potential cycle. A teenager uses cannabis. They experience its effects. They continue using. Tolerance can develop. They may need more to achieve the same effect. And eventually, what started as experimentation can become something much harder to control. The CDC lists signs of cannabis use disorder that include craving, unsuccessful attempts to quit, continuing despite problems, and giving up important activities in favor of cannabis. So we're not simply talking about one afternoon or one decision. We're talking about the possibility of introducing repeated exposure during a critical stage of brain development. Now comes the question scientists really want answered. If a teenager stops using cannabis, does the brain catch up? That's the million-dollar question. And science doesn't yet have a complete answer. Some cognitive effects can improve after abstinence, but the extent and permanence of developmental effects from adolescent exposure remain active areas of research. The CDC itself says more research is needed to fully understand long-term effects on developing brains. And that's why studies that follow young people over many years are so important, because the brain doesn't develop in one afternoon. So scientists can't fully understand its development by looking at one afternoon either. They need time. They need repeated measurements. They need biological evidence. They need enormous groups of participants. And they need to separate cannabis from all the other variables influencing a teenager's life. That's incredibly difficult. But researchers are getting closer. Think back to the construction site. Imagine seeing a sign, building in progress. Would you walk into the construction zone and start removing structural components? Probably not, because the building isn't finished. You don't yet know exactly what every piece is doing. The teenage brain is similar. It isn't broken. It isn't defective. It's developing. It's learning. It's adapting. And that's precisely why this period can also be vulnerable. Every experience becomes part of a developing environment. Exercise, relationships, nutrition, and potentially sleep, stress, education, drug exposure. The brain is taking information from the world around it and continually adapting. So perhaps the most important message isn't, teenagers have bad brains. It's the opposite. Teenagers have incredibly adaptable brains. And because they're adaptable, what happens during those years may matter enormously. So when you see a headline saying, teen cannabis use linked to slower memory and thinking growth, don't just ask, is marijuana bad? That's too simple. Ask something more interesting. Why would cannabis affect a developing brain differently from a mature brain? Ask, why did researchers find slower gains instead of simply lower scores? Ask, could the age someone starts using matter? Ask, does frequency matter? Ask, does THC potency matter? Ask, can the brain recover? And perhaps the most important question, how much of the brain's developmental trajectory can we afford to gamble with before we know the answer? Those are scientific questions, and they're much more useful than slogans. For teenagers, the decision may feel immediate. A party, a friend, a vape, an edible, a joint, one moment, one experience. But brain development doesn't happen in one moment. It happens over thousands of moments, every day, every year. And the choices made during those years can potentially influence what happens next. That doesn't mean someone who has used cannabis has ruined their future. It doesn't mean recovery is impossible. And it certainly doesn't mean we should shame people. Fear rarely produces good science or good decisions. Information does. Understanding does. And honest conversations do. The goal isn't to create panic. The goal is to understand the risk well enough to make an informed choice. So let's return to where we started. What if something you did at 16 could influence how your brain developed? We now have evidence suggesting that teenagers who begin using cannabis may show slower gains in several cognitive abilities over time. Memory, attention, language, processing speed. And researchers found evidence linking THC exposure specifically with worse memory over time in a subset of participants. But there are still unanswered questions. We don't know everything. We don't know exactly who will be affected. We don't know how much individual factors change the risk. And we don't know the full extent to which cognitive development can recover after stopping. But maybe that's exactly why this research deserves attention. Because when you're 16, you don't get to see the future version of your brain. You can't look 5 years ahead and compare two different versions of yourself. You can't see the development that might have happened or the development that might not have. You simply move forward, 1 year at a time, one decision at a time, one experience at a time. And somewhere inside your skull, that construction project continues. Connections are forming. Others are being refined. Memory is becoming more efficient. Attention is changing. Decision-making is maturing. Your brain is becoming the adult brain you're going to live with for decades. So perhaps the most important question isn't, will cannabis definitely damage my brain? Science can't honestly promise that every individual will experience the same outcome. The better question is, if my brain is still developing, do I really want to introduce a substance that research suggests could slow parts of that development? And maybe that's a question worth thinking about before the decision is made. Because sometimes the most important changes in our lives aren't the ones we can see. They're the ones happening quietly. Your brain is still under construction. What you do during construction process may matter more than you realize. Inside us, while we're still becoming who we're going to be,